Hi everyone, welcome back to Info 3370, studying social inequality with data science. Today we're starting our first independent investigation, and this is super exciting because we've been building the skills to get to this point for a while, where you're now going to go and find data yourselves, download that data, prepare it, produce a visualization, and then present that visualization to your peers. So here are our goals. Our goals are to create your own question and basically do those steps I just described so that you can tell a story using data and present that to some other people. So where to start? A great visualization often involves only a few variables. People think of data science often as involving thousands and thousands of variables and sifting through for these complicated stories. But I find that often the most compelling uses of statistics and quantitative evidence use only, say, maybe 3 or 4 variables at one time. This can produce a visualization that's super clear to readers and conveys an important point. I want to first motivate this idea using 2 examples from my own research, where I've used ggplot to make visualizations that you are all totally capable of making yourselves at this point. So one example comes from my work on housing eviction, and another example comes from work on racial disparities, which actually uses the CPS. So let's take this housing eviction example. In this study, I looked at 3 variables: race, family income, and eviction, for a cohort of kids born in 1998 to 2000 in large US cities. And the question here was really simple in this figure. How do the rates of housing eviction differ across categories of kids defined by race and several categories of family income? So here's the visualization that we made. We have on the bottom, we have eviction rates by race. So I have these 3 subgroups: Black, Hispanic, and white or other. And we see that eviction rates are really high for everybody. So between birth and when they turn 15 years old, like nearly 20% of Black kids got evicted from their home. And the rate was lower for white or other, 11.3%, but still pretty substantial. When we look at the top figure by permanent income relative to the poverty line, we see that while those with incomes above 300% of the poverty line had approximately a 4.7% eviction rate, the rate of eviction rose substantially as incomes dropped, so that if we look at those in really deep poverty, so their family earned less than 50% of the poverty line, it's like almost 29% of those kids were evicted from their homes. And so this is a case where this is purely a descriptive claim, where I have a descriptive claim within racial categories and within income categories. But I'm able to tell, I think, a fairly compelling story. So as a second example, I have a working paper using IPUMS-CPS. And in this study, I'm using 3 variables for the following visualization. I have race again, occupation, and a measure of health. And what I did was I took each occupation to be my unit of analysis. So I prepared the data until each row corresponded to one occupation. So like taxi drivers are an occupation. And I scored that occupation by the proportion Black in the occupation and by this measure of the proportion of people to report the onset of a work-limiting disability. And so here's what the visualization looks like. Again, this is ggplot, like you all know how to use. So what we see is a strong positive correlation where the occupations that are highly non-Hispanic Black, off to the right, also tend to have high onset of a work-limiting disability. And while this evidence in this figure is just descriptive, it points toward a bigger story about how occupational segregation by race might contribute to health inequality. So those are 2 examples from my own work doing this. I want to briefly point to some examples from other people. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics frequently uses the Current Population Survey to make these reports. And I think these reports are an excellent place to look when you want to get like some idea of what you might be able to do using the CPS data to say something important about inequality. So in this report, they're making a profile of the working poor. And here they define the working poor to be those who spent at least 27 weeks in the last year in the labor force, but whose income still fell below the official poverty level. And you can imagine how you could create an indicator for the working poor by looking in the CPS data, finding weeks worked in the past calendar year, and also income relative to the official poverty line. And what the BLS did with this study is they then summarized some information about the working poor. So they looked over time at how the rates of working poverty have changed in America from 1986 to 2020. They looked across categories of race and between men and women to see how the rates of working poverty differ across racial categories and across these gender categories. They also looked across educational attainment by gender here. So they have men and women who have various degrees of education, and we can see that working poverty is just really high among those with less than a high school degree. As another example, the Bureau of Labor Statistics also has this report on women's earnings in 2020. And here you can see they started out with a similar kind of story. They have the women's annual earnings as a percent of men's restricted to workers who were working full-time, I believe, for the full year. And we see that percent started really low. So women earned like 62 cents on the dollar to men's earnings, and now has risen to about 82 cents on the dollar by this measure. Then as we scroll down, they do something similar to the previous chart book, where they have here men and women by age, and we can see like women's median weekly earnings compared to men's median weekly earnings among those in various age categories. And then finally, they do a similar comparison across categories of gender and categories of race. So there's a lot that can be done with these data. You might want to look at differences in poverty, differences in pay and work experiences across various categories that we might care about. So I want to pause and talk briefly about those categories. So this is the page on the course website about this independent investigation. And if you scroll down to the bottom, we have this section, what is up with gender, sex, and race? So as we as a teaching team talked about these examples, there were some concerns about the fact that the Bureau of Labor Statistics talks about women's earnings here and men and women, but the variable available in IPUMS-CPS is actually sex, coded male, female. So I want to just briefly address some of the complexities that arise with these categories. So first off, sex and gender are not the same thing. Gender scholars understand sex to be a biological categorization that's assigned at birth. So this is like very much based on anatomy, and people could be male, female, or intersex are often categories used in reference to sex. And the variable in IPUMS-CPS is sex, coded male, female. So if that's sex, then what is gender? Gender is the socially constructed category which people perform all the time in their lives. And gender, there are many genders, so people could identify as man, woman, they could identify as non-binary. There are plenty of ways to think of oneself in terms of gender. So these two constructs are distinct. So if I study sex, how should I describe my results? We would encourage you to avoid the terms men and women and instead refer to sex gaps across those labeled as male and those labeled as female. And it would be great to also include intersex people, though IPUMS-CPS has everyone coded as male or female. So this leads to another question of why doesn't the CPS keep up with the times? So one reason for this is that this is a long-running study, and it's designed partly to make comparisons of demographic trends over time. And when you want to make comparisons over time, it's important that your survey instrument remain as constant as possible over that time period. And so for this reason, sometimes these surveys are a little slower to adapt to modern and present-day social science understanding of categories, in part because they're trying to maintain consistency with how things have been done in the past. So broadly, I would encourage you to use these categories because we really want to understand sex gaps in outcomes, but also use them cautiously while being aware that perhaps they're not as thorough as we would like. So if you'd like to learn more, there's a link here to the Genderbread person, which is a great resource. And then I've been talking a lot about gender and sex, but I do want to highlight that race actually has very similar problems. So race is also a social construct. The categories of race are defined by historical and cultural forces and also political forces. So the US Census has changed the categories that are available to respondents for their race over time. And broadly, we should also think of race as a socially constructed category. And similar to sex, I think it's important to study racial gaps in outcomes because we really care about resolving racial inequality. And it is also very important to recognize that the categories we use are imperfect measures of really complex phenomena. And so that's how we should generally approach thinking about sex and race in these studies. I think important questions that we have to answer, and also we should recognize the limits of the measures that we have available to us. So I want to close by coming back here to our goals for this independent investigation. Our goals are really that you'll create your own quantitative empirical question and select data to explore that question. We want you to produce a visualization to tell that story and present that story to another group in the class. I think this can be a lot of fun. I think it'll take more time than you might anticipate. So we're starting this on Wednesday, and we're going to spend Wednesday, Friday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday on this activity. So I would expect you might be selecting variables and thinking about the question on Wednesday, probably also on Friday some. On Monday and Wednesday, you then might be preparing the data and producing a visualization. And then on Friday of next week, we'll be presenting the visualization to other groups. So generally, I'd say go for it as quick as you can. I would think about what question is of interest to your group, pick 3 or 4 variables relevant to that question, and then get going on preparing those variables, because that's going to be challenging but also rewarding. So we're looking forward to what you produce.